measurement question. Do we have, when we take leaves to the Eco Center, do we have a sense of how much is coming from Princeton versus how much is coming from Lawrence? And is that another way to gauge things? Because the same storms that hit us probably hit them, but if our percentage is going down, it's almost like the sewage authority. If our percentage of leaves is going down, maybe that's some sort of indication that this campaign is working.
Of course, I forgot to bring that number with me, but as I recall, was it last year or the year before? I guess it was last year, we brought 22,000 cubic yards of leaves, and Lawrence had, I think it was 13 or 15,000 cubic yards. So we brought more to them. They bring a lot more material to Britain than we do, though we've taken material there also. I'm not telling you, drawing conclusions on their process, but when they are closer to that facility, from a time standpoint, time management standpoint, they take their material there and pay the fee there right now, as opposed to trucking it into the ecological center. Business decision on their part, thus they do take more stuff there right now.
Okay, so looking at our percentage in terms of what's being taken there is not really a great indicator then of anything. You can't really
We're working with them to get all of their numbers to compare with all of ours, just to see if they brought all their material there, what would happen to that facility.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Miller.
I just had a follow-up question about the mulching mower, because I have been curious about that. How much can a lawn take? I mean, you know, in some yards that have a couple huge trees, the leaves are about this deep. Maybe this is for you guys too on the PEC. I don't like. Could we conceivably mulch all of our leaves on our municipal property, for instance? Because it doesn't seem like we have any that are places that are completely shady. And
I will leave that to Greg O'Neill. I am told by him, no, we cannot do it all on our municipal property based on the volume of leaves that come down. We cannot do it all. We cannot.
Maybe not and have grass. I mean, how could that be in a forest? Nobody.
All I can tell you is that he's told me no. There's leaves we have to truck
right.
out.
And
I think what might happen is that your lawn will turn into dirt like it is in the forest.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think part of it too, it's that this doesn't have to be an all or nothing either. And so if you have people mulching a third of their leaves, then we're reducing a third of the amount that we're taking. So
yeah,
the education component makes a complete total sense. And I think we'll be working with you to try to get something in the guide. If we do this guide we were talking about earlier, it would be great to have some of this information to help homeowners and direct them to resources, because I think that, especially if you can make the case that this is good for your garden and good for your lawn, it seems like a no-brainer that if we make it easy for people to do it, that they'll want to do it, and it helps out the town too. Mr. Miller?
Yeah, a question, and really a request for clarification. The memo really deals with leave the leaves. It doesn't deal with leave the brush. And item 4 requests that the Public Works Department, keep a database of leaf and brush costs. And I'd really suggest that what we want to do is disaggregate those costs so that we're not piling the costs of brush management on top of the costs of leaf management. And since we're not talking about leave the brush, let's focus on the costs of leaf management rather than leaf and brush management.
Over the last 8 weeks that we've been, now 9 with this extra collection, we have been collecting data with regard to what it's cost us to collect the brush.
We want the other data, it sounds like, on the leaves. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Bob.
We never moved on this resolution. I do want to thank the Environmental Commission for the, there are a couple more comments. Yeah, come on up. You have to come to the mic, though.
Madam Mayor, members of council, Daniel Harris again. I simply want to say, the PEC, I'm going to abbreviate the comments that you have written in the interest of time. I trust your bedtime reading will pick up the slack. The PEC has generated a wonderful memorandum on the new management of leaves, and I want to commend everyone who worked on it long and hard, and to recommend that PEC adopt the memorandum. The important segment going forward concerns public education. PEC has done a great job in covering the major issues in Section 2. And just to head off potential conflict, Mr. Simon, Section 3 of, or Point 3 of Section 2, Public Education, in its black print as opposed to its green print, does address the issue that you are concerned with, and that is the difference between small lots which may not have the capacity to mulch or compost on the one hand, and large lots which may. And there's a request here, an important one, I think, for a town audit. How that would actually be conducted, I don't know. But there is a huge amount of respect on PEC for that differential, and it's been a central matter of conversation all the way along. PEC rightly recommends that the Department of Public Works take responsibility for explaining how the current LEAF program works and how improvements can be made, including proper bagging, composting, or mulching. I've been delighted to hear Bob Huff's comments so far this evening. It's all an effort to explain why leaves are not trash, but a valuable resource. Financial costs of the current program need to be gathered. We don't need to have an absolute deadline, but we need to keep that in progress so that government and the public can understand costs and their implication for the entire Princeton budget. Costs should be incorporated as they become known into the education program. Gasoline costs are, I think, easily gathered. Mr. Huff is, of course, right that their work primarily is not with documentation, but with doing the work. On the other hand, we are all really needful of hard information, and I think that is recognized. There are fixed mileage routes in Princeton and to and from Lawrenceville or Cranberry. Cost per gallon, average miles per gallon of each truck can be known without too much trouble. Deadline for presentation of gasoline costs remains important. We can't have that information immediately, but through fall of 2014, spring of 2015, we ought to have good numbers ready for your consideration by the time of the 2016 budget. PEC rightly recommends use of the official Princeton website for purposes of education. This can also and should be done with the Sustainable Princeton website, which can include information on how to shred, mulch, and compost. It should be done on a regular basis. In my view, it should be a posting which people will see no matter what, and not a web link that requires active clicking. Sometimes if you require people to do something, they simply balk. There are many, leave that aside. The Princeton Public Library is also a good venue for direct education on Leave the Leaves Alone. In addition to leadership representation from DPW, the mayor herself might occasionally be present, as well as representatives from Sustainable Princeton and the PEC. The public needs to know by visible and personal means that the entire municipal government is engaged in sustainable leaf management through best environmental practices. Personnel at public meetings might also include, in addition to DPW, PEC, and Sustainable Princeton, a municipal engineer or public safety officer for roads and stormwater hazards, people from the planning office to help, as Mr. Simon is concerned, with discussion of division between small lot high-rise units that may not have capability for on-site composting, and on the other hand, large lots that do have on-site composting capabilities.
Hi, Daniel. Sorry to cut you off. We're like on a little bit of a tighter time schedule, but this whole entire letter can be put in the record, even if you don't read it to us.
Fine. I want to make one more, the next paragraph, I'd simply like to read, This is the unusual one. The mayor and Princeton Council might ask legal counsel for a memorandum outlining the legal responsibilities of homeowners for leaves on their properties. I'll leave the rest for you to read at bedtime. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Hiltner. I live on Harrison Street. And I've been, as you know, working on this issue for a very long time. You know, we've been requesting data for years and years, probably going back to 2009. And the Bureau did supply us excellent data at one time under Chris Budzinski, and that was a brief moment of clarity on this issue. And I also largely wrote the brochure for that suggests how people can use their leaves on their property. Since then, I don't think things have changed at all. I would suggest that education is a way to make environmentalists work very hard, and the people who don't care about this issue and will just continue doing what they've always done don't have to work at all. So I would suggest that education you'd be very skeptical about what kind of progress you'll get from that, particularly when the ordinance is not being enforced. That is the education. That's what people hear. I just talked to a landscaper Sunday morning who was dumping his leaves right next to a street drain, and they were halfway out to the center line. I told him, you know, that's not the ordinance. And he said, well, he's always done it that way. And I said, but that's, so you're not going to follow the law. And he said, well, if it'll make you happy, as if it's all for me, he went back and changed it a little bit. But as long as you don't enforce the ordinance, that is the education, and that is running completely contradictory to all the hard efforts of the Environmental Commission members and people who really care about this issue and want to save the city a lot of money. And in terms of whether leaf piles kill trees, where I grew up, we loved leaves. I'd jump in when I was a kid. It was great fun. And then we'd pile them back in the woods, and no trees died. I would like to see the data of anyone who's alleging that a leaf pile will kill trees, because my experience with trees is they just their roots head straight for that leaf pile. They want to get as much nutrients out of it as possible. So I don't think we should be scaring people with the idea that they're going to kill trees if they pile leaves on their property, unless we have really good data to suggest that. I have many other things to say, but I will only say that you really need to containerize this stuff, because if you just throw it out on the bigger container you have, the more stuff people will throw out. And the streets are a huge container. And that's why people are generating so much of the stuff, is because it's not contained. A lot of cities put it in 95, they give people, or they buy them, 95-gallon roll-out bins. It's a very efficient system. People change their practices. We are very adaptable. People change. They figure out, oh, I can use these leaves under the, I can chop them up with a mower, or I can put them in a back corner. That's how you change people. You don't change them by saying, please. I've tried that with individuals. Little Brook School, very dangerous on Abernathy Street. People dump their leaves way out into the street. I've talked to the landscapers. They don't change. So you need to enforce this ordinance, or the ordinance doesn't really exist in people's minds. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we still have to vote on the schedule for this year, but I just want to reiterate, and I know education only goes to so far, but I think it is a really key component of this, and that we want to work with the Environmental Commission in Sustainable Princeton and all of you who are here tonight to get some really good, clear language so that we are communicating that to residents at the same time that they're getting the schedule. So anyway, is there a motion for the resolution for the schedule?
So
for
moved.
Second.
It's moved by Mr. Lieberman and seconded by Ms. Krummeller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The resolution passes unanimously. And now we're going to go back. We have a couple ordinance public hearings tonight. The first one is an ordinance creating a no parking zone on a portion of Markham Road and amending the code of the Borough of Princeton, New Jersey, 1974. If there's no questions about this ordinance, then I'm going to open up the public hearing. And seeing no one, I will close the public hearing. And are there any further questions or discussion on council? If not, is there a motion?
I'll move it.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Ms. Butler. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Ms. Howard?
Yes.
Ms. Crummiller?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Liverman?
Yes.
Ms. Butler?
Yes.
Mr. Simon?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, the ordinance passes unanimously. The next, and before we get to this one, just some house cleaning here. We do need to hold a public hearing on this ordinance by law, but there's, the version was amended again substantively by the Code Review Committee. That's why we have it also listed. A different version is the ordinance introduction. So I will read this. I probably speak for the Code Review Committee, which says that we hope that the ordinance that's listed here as a public hearing fails so that we can pick up the introduction.
That's right.
Actually, just to clarify, we've been through this before. We just have to amend it, and then it goes to public hearing next. We don't have to reject the original. We went through this last year.
And that's the way that the statute reads, is that it doesn't have to actually fail. Excuse me.
It just has to be amended.
It just has to be amended during the public hearing, and then if it's amended, then essentially it gets reintroduced as amended.
Okay.
So
That's fine.
it doesn't actually have to fail.
But in this case, since we have the two, it seems cleaner just to do the one and then introduce.
What I would simply suggest is that we amend the Parks and Rec ordinance to be the second version that we have. And do we have the red line version actually in the packet?
Yeah.
But
Yes.
first, we need to hold the public hearing. So I'm going to open up the public hearing, and this will be the public hearing on the ordinance that was introduced earlier. So I'll also take public comment on the revised version after which is likely going to be amended in a minute.
So please don't say anything.
So I'll open up the public hearing on the original ordinance by Princeton concerning recreation and parks and similar public places and amending the Code of the Borough of Princeton, New Jersey, 1974, and the Code of the Township of Princeton, New Jersey, 1968. And we just hold for a second, because I think you want to speak to the newer version, right? All right, so I'm going to open the public hearing on that version, and then are you saying keep the public hearing open and then amend it? Or close that public hearing?
I think we amend it during the public hearing, right? That
Right.
we would, someone would offer an
You can
amendment.
amend it during the public hearing, and then you would vote on the amendments.
To reintroduce?
Whether or not you want to pass those amendments, and then you'd have to vote a second time for reintroduction after another meeting.
All right, in that case, if you would like to speak, why don't we all first, why don't we amend it so that we're clear what we're talking
Put
about?
on the table the amended ordinance, and we're saying goodbye to the other ordinance.
Is that a motion?
That's a motion.
Okay.
And I'll second that.
Okay, so it's moved by
Now
Ms.
we can speak.
Moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Miller to amend the ordinance to reflect the one that's listed here under introduction. And do we need a roll call vote for that?
Actually, before you do it, there's one additional change that was suggested by a member of the public regarding smoking in the parks, and I just wanted to let you know what that proposal was, so you can consider that at the same time. Basically, there is the Board of Health ordinance that prohibits smoking in public places. So essentially, the change would be to add under Section 16-6 under a new JJ to speak to the smoking in public and how it is prohibited. So it would read, "No person shall engage in smoking in any park or recreation area, comma, as prohibited by Princeton Board of Health Ordinance 2013-01, comma, as may be amended," period. So it would just be one additional amendment.
And thank you, Lisa, for doing that. That basically harmonizes, making that suggestion harmonizes it with the Board of Health ordinance. So I think that's terrific, and hope we can include that.
So Jenny, I think you would technically need to say that your amendment would include the smoking. You're moving to...
Yes.
And do you second that, Mr. Miller, the revised amendment? Okay. And then, do we need a roll call on the amendment, or can we just do that by voice?
Can I just ask a question? Should we have public comment before the final vote in case there's any other amendments we want to entertain? Because doesn't the vote actually close the discussion?
On the public hearing, it does.
Right, so if we
not on
want-
the reintroduction.
I think
Well, I don't want to split hairs here, so we're welcome, I mean, we can take,
Let's
we'll
just
postpone the
let
vote,
public
and so, Scotia, if you'd like to speak, now would be a perfect time.
I'm Scotia McRae from Evelyn Place in Princeton. And basically, I think the matter I want to speak about doesn't concern the matters that you were speaking about. The Friends of Princeton, I'm a relatively new board member on the Friends of Princeton Open Space, and I hope you all received a letter from Wendy Mager, who is the chair of the board of the Friends of Princeton Open Space.
Scotia, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. Can you just make sure you're speaking right into the mic?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Sorry. So basically, the Friends of Princeton Open Space adopted a resolution at its most recent meeting opposing the ordinance insofar as it places passive parks and open space under the jurisdiction of the Board of Recreation Commissioners. Now, my understanding is, and Mr. Huff could speak to this, that in the past, the Friends of Princeton Open Space have communicated with the Public Works Department, with Greg O'Neill, and had a very easy relationship. The feeling of the board is that the Recreation Commission is really concerned with collecting fees from various recreational facilities and worrying about playing fields, and passive open space is a completely different use, and passive open space is not so passive in management. It needs ecological management. There's clearing of trails, building of bridges, all of that kind of stuff that really doesn't concern the Recreation Commission. So I am aware that the council doesn't want to add to bureaucracy. So if there could be some kind of citizens committee that is not governed by a state statute that could work with parks and recreation and with Greg O'Neill without being under the jurisdiction of the Recreation Board. That's the main concern.
Thank you. I think that's a fabulous point, and it's something we had talked about, I think, a couple years ago, which was to establish a Parks Commission, which is, I think, the idea that you're getting at. But I'm curious, maybe somebody from the Code Review Committee could explain if you had talked about this and what your feelings were.
Well, one of the big issues is that the state statute, and Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, it requires, I mean, the Recreation Commission has always been in charge of the open space, so nothing has changed in terms of the law with this ordinance. You know, it's always been that way. I think what the FOPOS is talking about is really our organizational structure and how our staff works, because we still have an open space director.
Right.
And so one of the things that we talked about in the Code Review Committee meeting is, and I think, you know, you and I discussed this, is that one thing that would be helpful is to know specifically what types of things aren't being done that should be done, because, you know, the staff doesn't really, I mean, you know, do we hear, oh, there's a log on the trail and nobody's fixed it, you know?
I can speak to some of that, because I know there's been like a discussion I want to weigh in too. I mean, I think that there's like, we had the management plan come in for the Princeton East Ridge, right? And I think there's long-term management of open space in terms of invasive species management. I think you have an area where there's a ton of volunteers. So you have FOPOS, you have a group that's working on Herrontown Woods, you have other community groups, and to have a group that's helping to facilitate that and helping to facilitate the relationship between the staff and the volunteer groups, and to do some long-term planning. And it's, you know, in terms of the Open Space Fund, you know, we've had a policy of using most of that money for acquisition. And the Citizens Finance Committee did an analysis of it a couple years ago, when right before we consolidated. And the thought was we might want to start moving to spend some of that money on maintenance, because we have acres and acres of land. And if we're not doing invasive species management, if we're not you know, spending money on maintaining the trails, on replanting, on making sure that we're being good stewards, it's sort of like having a building and never putting any money into the maintenance of the building, and we know how that can turn out. And so it would be a group that's focused on those issues. And I know, I'm sure that I get the minutes from the rec board meeting, and they have a lot on their plate, so I think it's just a question, I think it's a worry of things falling through the cracks when you have a group of people who are there because their primary focus and interest is on active recreation, which is another really important service that the town provides. So, you know, and I think it's also a way to engage more volunteers too, but I think it's really a question of like, do we have more bureaucracy, as having another committee create more problems, or is it a useful thing? So I wasn't sure how much the Code Review Committee had gotten into those questions, or if it was just, this is a standard language, so that's what you're bringing to us.
Well, we did discuss it with the recreation, I mean, and there's just a lot of questions, because it's complicated. If we create a new commission, it's a snowball effect. We have to get equipment.
This is the same resolution that we have always had, forever. In 2009, the rec board could have gotten up in the morning and called themselves Parks and Rec. This is the state commission. We talked at length about wanting to maintain this structure, in part because, you know, we don't want to do this work. If the rec board were just advisory, all the work that they do would fall to us, setting the fees. You know, they hire hundreds of people every summer. You know, our meetings would go till 8 a.m. So we did discuss at length keeping this statute as is. And basically that's what we've tried to do with a lot of these ordinances, as little as possible. Yes, review them, but really try to capture what we're currently doing. The confusion is that the borough spent their open space money maintaining the parks, just as you're describing, whereas I think the township did more saving to make acquisitions. There wasn't so much open space in the borough, so we did use our open space funds for park maintenance. The vestige of the two communities is that the open space manager, the arborist, reports to Public Works. That's where he was in the township, and it never really made sense to move him over into a reporting line through the rec department. What you're suggesting is not mutually exclusive with passing this ordinance. And in fact, I would recommend that we do need to pass this ordinance, because the rec department, the Parks and Rec Commission is actually, conducting a lot of business, and I think that it's important for them to have this legal structure. But having a citizens committee to talk with Greg O'Neill about what you want done with the open space is not inconsistent with this ordinance.
Right. I think there's a concern about how much power the Recreation Board would have over
They've
open
always
space.
had that power. That's what I'm telling you.
Well, maybe that's...
This is...
So the Friends of Princeton Open Space feels that this is a discussion that should be had before this ordinance passes, so that we don't down the road have problems. And to answer your question, Jenny, I did some investigating as to what exactly the work has done. I had a long discussion with Greg O'Neill, who said basically there are two volunteers associated with Friends of Princeton Open Space, Clark Lennon and Ted Thomas, and they basically organize huge amounts of work that Greg says the municipality simply cannot handle and would need at least 3 to 4 other employees to clear the trails, to rebuild the bridges, to saw through trees that have fallen down and blocked the trails. And basically, all of that work is being done by by very dedicated volunteers, but we can't necessarily rely on those volunteers being available in perpetuity. And at some point, the municipality is really going to have to consider, the care of the open space. So the request is to discuss further exactly how this would all work.
Well, and I do think that's a really good idea, and as I said, I don't think it's mutually exclusive with this ordinance. I mean, is there a specific...
I think the specific issue is that the board of the Friends of Princeton Open Space feels strongly that the Recreation Commission should not be in charge of the open space and making decisions about what happens with the open space, since the funding stream is different and the needs are different.
I have a question. Is there a way to, in the ordinance, to define parks and recreation areas more narrowly? Because, I think this is the issue. It's like, I think that playgrounds, parks with playgrounds, parks with athletic fields, those should certainly be under the domain of the rec board. I don't think anybody is debating that. And so if we define the ordinance narrowly, and it would not include mountain lakes, it would not include Woodfield Reservation, it would not include some of the bigger properties, Herrontown Woods, so it would include Smoyer Park, it would not include Herrontown Woods, then that maybe is a way to get around this issue, and it would actually help, I think, to define who would be in charge of what.
I think we thought we had the same idea, and my understanding was that the state statute wouldn't allow us to do that, but
Well, the statute that enables the municipality to create the Parks and Recreation, Board of Parks and Recreation Commissioners as it's defined in the proposed ordinance, under one of the provisions of the statute, it states that the board shall have full control over the lands, playgrounds, and recreation places acquired or leased under the provision, under these statutes, by the municipality. So the municipality owns the lands and the board manages them. And it's a very broad use of language in terms of all lands, playgrounds, and recreation places, and it's my understanding that recreation places, as we discussed it, is relatively broad, and it's not just active recreation, it's also...
Wait, are you talking about the state statute right now?
Yes, and, well, also it says all lands, so I would say that's all recreation lands, and I think that includes open space. I don't think you can really I think it'd be very, very difficult, even if you tried to delineate the difference between active and passive. And even if you could, I think it'd be really difficult.
Does the rec board have the ability, because I know, for example, mayor and council is given a lot of authority that we deed over to Bob. as the administrator. So would it be possible for the rec board to, even though it's given this power, to then give it to a separate Parks Commission to do the passive part?
You can answer that, but I don't, it wouldn't be a commission. I mean, we're establishing the Parks and Rec Commission. So
It could be an advisory body, but it would have to report back to the board. That being said, the way that things are operated now is that Public Works does a lot of the work in the parks and open space. Now, it may not be doing as much as it could. I'm not sure about the open space, but right now it's really shared with Recreation Department doing the bulk of the maintenance, but also Public Works. And there's no reason not to utilize Public Works as much as possible to the extent that they're able to provide those services. So there's no reason that the board, see, what happens, Ben said that, the Recreation Director said that what happens is that a question or concern will come into him, and maybe he will or he won't discuss it with the board, but then he'll go to Public Works and say, well, we have an issue with something in one of the parks or an open space area. So he uses the resources of the entire municipality and not only the Recreation Department or the board's resources. And also the open space funds are in a completely separate fund that can't be spent by the Board of Recreation Commissioners. That's the council's to spend.
Yeah, I really wanted to emphasize that we have complete control over the open space money. The commission does not have control over that.
By law, they only have control over their fund. They have control over the funds that come in for the program fees and that sort of a thing. Those are the funds that the Recreation Board has control over.
Okay.
It can't dip into another.
But they also receive money from the municipality to supplement their fund through the municipal budget, and that's how you would be able to fund this. If it's a priority of the council, you say, here's $100,000 or whatever it costs, we're going to place this in your budget, just as we do for maintenance. I mean, they bid out a portion of maintenance. Maybe this would be something you would bid out every year, trail clearing or whatever it may be, and you would just budget that in the budget. They would take care of putting out bid specifications and the work would get done. I do think that you want to try to keep it as one-stop shopping the best you can. If it's a priority of the council and it's something you want done, then you've got to back that priority by saying we're willing to fund it through some source, whether it's tax dollars, whether it's the open space fund and the like, and then the staff can take care of getting it done. And you can get the suggestions from Friends of Open Space or whatever group you want to say, here are the things we need to get done. The stewardship plan is great. Then we can put some dollars, assign that to it, and then fund it, and then evaluate every year to see whether the funding is sufficient to accomplish what you want to get done.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the worries is in the past when there would be an acquisition that you'd have a park, and the question would be, what do you use the park for? And there would sometimes be a debate between the proponents of active recreation and the proponents of passive recreation. And I think part of the fear is that you're somewhat deciding on the answer to that question if all of those decisions are being made by an active recreation group. But I guess the question is that a council decision and or would we be in a situation, because I know the rec board as a board is almost like the health board. I mean, it's the most analogous where they are somewhat independent of council, and I think that's the concern would be you're making policy decisions, and those policy decisions have a point of view that's likely to be sort of attached to them ahead of time just because of where it is, unless the rec board, has its makeup radically changed, but then you might be shortchanging the amount of people who want to put the energy into the stuff that the rec board normally does.
Right. I mean, and Friends of Princeton Open Space has nothing against the rec board. It's just that it's so different from the active recreation is so different from the concerns of open space. And I am not an attorney, and I don't know how to resolve this, but to address your point, Joe, as far as the Friends of Princeton Open Space is aware, they were never aware of the fact that they were under the Recreation Board. So
I appreciate that they may not have known that, but they were, and the debates that were occurring between proponents of passive and active recreation were occurring under this very same structure. If we buy a piece of property for whatever purpose, we determine what that purpose is, not the rec board. We would decide whether we want to put a playground or a field or a trail. That would be a decision we would make here when we purchase the property, and then it would be up to them to sort of maintain or do whatever we decide to do with it.
Right.
It's really no different than it has ever been. And whether they knew it or not is
I can't speak
immaterial.
to that, but I think the concerns ought to be taken into consideration because there are other municipalities. In fact, right now there's a big tussle in Hamilton over an area that some people want to add playing fields to and others don't. Right now, Princeton apparently has enough playing fields. So.
We can still have that discussion. Even with this ordinance, we can still have that discussion. That doesn't change, and it doesn't move it to the rec board.
I think what happened in the past, and I think part of the concern is, it's good. I think the major policy decisions are probably going to happen here at council, but I think given that FOPOS didn't even know that that these open space areas were under the guise of the rec board, I think was partly because the rec board, again, was busy with its agenda over the active parks. And so I think the concern is that what happens is that those issues are not going to rise to the top of the agenda in terms of importance and the time that's being spent. I feel like we're in this state now where we've done a lot of acquisition in the 1980s, there was a ton of acquisition, and now we're getting to the point where we have to start really looking at what we have and making those, maintenance investments. And if it's not a priority,
But Liz, if we want to spend open space money, that's a decision that has to occur here. And I can tell you that Public Works doesn't have the manpower to do more than they're doing. And, Rec has, I think, already talked to Bob about they need additional people to keep up with the additional work that they've taken on. So if there's going to be any new work done on trails, if we decide this is what we want to do, as Bob said, it is really going to require a decision here to spend significantly more money. And we're the only ones that can make that decision. So,
well, I guess the concern from the Friends of Princeton Open Space is, what if the rec board suddenly decides that they want something that is not consistent with what the Friends of Princeton Open Space think is consistent with passive recreation. So what would be the conflict resolution process?
You have to speak at the mic if you want to speak.
Is it possible to put somebody from Friends of Open Space on the board? Designate it, change your...
They didn't want that.
I think the membership numbers are fixed probably, right?
Yeah, I think they are. I think they're 5-year terms.
They are fixed by statute, and you can designate in the ordinance.
Well, we can just put somebody on there. We don't necessarily need to designate them Friends of Open Space. And there are people on the rec board that do care about open space. Ben is a trail guy. There are people that do. They're not as mutually exclusive as you think. And Bob Huff, can you help me out here? Greg O'Neill is still our arborist and open space manager, is he not?
That is correct.
So there is a lot of coordination between Ben Stenz at Rec and Greg O'Neill. They seem to have a very clear idea of how to get the work done.
But Princeton Open Space has no problem with that chain of command. But so if this ordinance is passed, does that mean that the Recreation Board is going to be reviewing all of the open space decisions? I mean, how is that going to work? I think we need some clarity as to
I really think that starts with the governing body. If you have a stewardship plan and you can put a dollar amount to what you think needs to be done in any given year, then the council can consider that within the budget. The administration can then work with the Recreation Commission, or in this case really the staff, which would be Ben and Greg, and determine how we're going to implement that plan and who's going to take charge of really getting it done. Because it's likely it is going to be a little bit of both.
Right, so there is a stewardship plan, and there is, I mean, so basically, Friends of Princeton Open Space has been doing exactly what you suggested. It's been dealing directly with recreation, or parks and public works and all, and Greg directly. So I'm not...
It's really it's the financial commitment to implementing the plan.
Right.
That will kick it up on our priority list. If we have it and we have the funding to do it, then we have really the obligation to try to implement that on behalf of the council. They're saying, get this done, here's your money, and then it's up to the staff to make sure that we can get it done, or show that for some reason we don't have sufficient funding, or it can't be, whatever that may be. But I really think if you have the commitment when you're doing your goal setting, when you're doing your budgeting, which is coming up, to say, we want to get this, done, budget the money, and I can't imagine that the staff is not going to be able to, make some positive inroads on that. May not be perfect the first year out, but it can be done.
I think the issue is that I think oftentimes these boards and committees act as, they're not really supposed to, but let's be honest, they do, as sort of advocacy groups for the issues that they're about. And so if you don't have it, then that's my concern, is that you lose that voice. But here's another way around it, maybe. So, we just created this affordable housing task force, even though we have an affordable housing board, and they're tasked with looking at properties and, looking at their potential use for affordable housing. And so is this something where we could have a task force that would be made up of residents in the community that are, are interested and passionate and do a lot of work already with open space issues, and task them with a particular piece that normally might fall under this, but that we'd be giving to this task force to come up with a plan? Because any plan is going to be implemented by the staff. It's really advisory to council in terms of putting together priorities, putting together plans that then we can decide that we want to go forward with recommendations.
It would be advisory to the board as well. And then, in turn, the board would work with council, and it even states in the ordinance now that everything's implemented through the rec department and such other municipal officials and departments as necessary. So it's very broad in terms of how these things get implemented. That means it can be volunteers, it can be volunteer boards.
But does this preclude us from doing a task force, an open space task force?
No, because that task force would just be advisory, though. It wouldn't be able to take any action on its own. So you can absolutely create a task force to provide advice to the council and to the board and to the recreation department as to the different areas that may need to be remedied in the different
How is it, if we have FOPOS, why do we need a task force?
Because FOPOS doesn't do every piece of open space.
As far as I can figure out, it does as much as it can.
Right, but there's other properties that aren't on FOPOS.
And there's a whole stewardship plan that task force could maybe review and say maybe it's time to implement this part of the stewardship plan, or make suggestions along that line. I wish Wendy were here because she's the attorney and I'm not.
Well, again, I don't think it is mutually exclusive with passing this ordinance tonight.
No, because what I'm hearing
if we want to institute some of that maintenance management plan, I think that's something council can take up.
Absolutely. This doesn't foreclose the council from spending money and looking for different ways of improving other areas of open space and the parks, because the council and the board have to work together or this won't work. Because if the board doesn't essentially implement a lot of the council's policy, then the board's not going to exist anymore. So it's, the council's still ultimately in charge and can provide checks and balances for the board.
Before creating another task force, which is certainly one way of attacking the problem, I wonder if we're really the first municipality in the state of New Jersey to face this kind of issue and how other municipalities have dealt with it. I'm certain that there are other municipalities that have very strong active recreation programs the way Princeton does, and other municipalities that have a considerable amount of open space that they manage the way we do. And I can't believe that this is the first instance where the question has come up of how do you give voice, a comparable voice to the people who are interested in the management of the open space to those that are interested in the active recreation programs.
So I have been trying to do some research on exactly that, because it seems like a common issue, but I really haven't had time to come up with any case studies. So I guess that's what Friends of Princeton Open Space is asking for, is more time to consider.
Bernie, I think what you're saying is correct, but I think Joe is on point with saying that you have no limitations if you adopt this ordinance. It really is not going to impact one way or the other what you decide to do with the open space. So I would recommend you adopt the ordinance, and if it's something you really feel strongly about as a group to pursue, and it's open space maintenance, then task us with starting to pull a plan together. We can work with representatives from Friends of Princeton Open Space to come up with something that you can implement budget-wise, and then you can make a decision whether you want to implement it. Because every town, you're right, does maintenance. In West Windsor, they have a huge open space program. They acquired hundreds and hundreds of acres of parkland, or farmland, some of which they maintain, most of which they don't. And they have a whole division of their public works, which is called their Parks and Recreation Division. So towns handle it differently. We can look at what they're doing and how they're spending it and how they're implementing it. But the bottom line is it's going to come down to you folks making a budget decision as to how much you want to allocate.
And I just want to clarify something too, is that tonight we can't vote on adoption because there were significant changes to the wording of the ordinance. So it is an introduction tonight, and so it's not the final word. And if it is introduced, there would be a public hearing on the 27th. And so we'd have another crack at making sure that these questions are answered too. Stephanie?
I just wanted to reiterate, having a Friends of Princeton Open Space representative on the Parks and Rec board seems like a simple solution, and then brings credibility to it.
I'll just add that if I recall, the letter said that the letter
they don't want to be on it.
Did not want that.
I've gotten that message pretty loud and clear.
I agree too, but I think the letter that from Wendy said that was not an acceptable solution.
Right, and I also, with all due respect to Wendy, there are some errors in her description of how the organization operates. It's just not right.
Bob, I'm not recommending that we not pass the ordinance. I think that the issue comes down to this, in my mind. The issue comes down to where do those who are interested in the management of open space go with what they want to have done. Do they go to the open space manager, who is in the organization someplace, and place their request before the open space manager, or do they come to council and bring their requests to council? And it seems to me that we need to give some guidance as to how this gets done.
But let us take a crack at that between now and your next meeting. I think we can come up with a process that'll work for you, but ultimately it's going to land on your plate.
Right.
That's what I'm saying.
Bernie, I think it depends on what the request is. If it's something, done in a day, relatively minor, there are a number of places, Well, you go to Ben, you could go to Greg O'Neill, or you could go to Access Princeton. You could load everything you want done on Access Princeton. If it's, trails or a tree or something, and all of that will be dealt with. If you're talking about a more philosophical long-term strategy, like the maintenance plan or management plan we heard the other day, that's just going to take money, and that has to come to us.
But I think it's a good idea to be thinking about this, and I think, Bernie, looking at other towns just is a no-brainer. And so I think what we're saying is we hear your concerns, and we're trying to figure it out, and we're going to, but we want to pass the ordinance.
And I'll say that most of the ordinances I looked at in helping draft this were very similar in terms of how they were drafted for other towns with recreation commissioners.
Yeah.
It really, I think it's going to come down to the practical, everyday workings of how these municipalities are dealing with open space and active recreation.
Right, but I think we should...
As opposed to what's in the ordinance.
I think we should address the problem. I mean, it's a big concern, obviously.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think it's more than just money, too. It's not just, let's write a check for this, because what are you writing a check for? There's policy decisions involved, and I think enough complicated policy decisions that for us to be working those out at council meetings, it's bad enough as it is with the sort of larger, sort of bigger picture issues that we're dealing with, that we do need to have people who are able to get down to the weeds at subcommittee meetings to do the work. Yes.
Really down in the weeds.
Okay, well, thank you and please thank Wendy, too, for bringing this to our attention.
Okay, thank you very much.
I had a question that I wanted to ask. See, I don't see Ben here, or maybe Joe, maybe you know this. One of the new aspects of this ordinance is that we're kind of formalizing our rental plan for parks so that private residents can reserve a park.
Right.
And I wondered if, can we limit it to Princeton residents, or would we want to? I just thought of that when I was...
You actually can't if you used any Green Acres money. I mean, what that does is that kind of encumbers, all your parks have to be open to everyone.
Okay, good, easy answer. And then the other one is, do we have a list yet of the parks, or?
No, they were going to look, he and Bob Gregory were going to go survey the parks, but I think Lisa didn't feel it needed to be part of this ordinance.
Yeah.
That they could go do that at whenever they could get to it, but they were going to go look at the parks and look at it was going to require probably an investment of some capital to fix up, get park benches, get appropriate containers to hold fire and whatnot.
Yeah, this will just require the board to designate the areas that are where you can reserve an area. And yes, I believe they have to reinvest some more money into the grills and maybe some signage and things like that.
It's already been, I think you can call the question. Okay, so the revised ordinance has been moved by Ms. Krummeller, and it included the language that you read about no smoking in the parks, and it was seconded by Mr. Miller, and this is for an ordinance introduction. And is everybody ready to vote now? Okay. Madam Clerk, please call the roll.
Ms. Howard?
Yes.
Ms. Krummeller?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Liverman?
Yes.
Ms. Butler?
Yes.
Mr. Simon?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay, so this ordinance is introduced, and the public hearing will be at our next meeting on October 27th. And now we come to Resolution 14-294, the PSA for White Buffalo Wildlife Management Services 2015, not to exceed $93,800.
I'll move it.
Moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Miller. Are there any questions about this resolution? Do we still have a quorum here? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Did you vote on that, Joe, for the record? Okay. Okay. The resolution passes. The next is Resolution 14-295, United Bow Hunters of New Jersey Agreement. Moved by Mr. Miller.
Second.
And seconded by Mr. Liverman. Is there any discussion or questions?
I'll just comment. comment that once again this year, we're responding to the fact that if we don't do this, we will not get approval from the state to do the larger deer management program. And it is the larger deer management program, the White Buffalo program, that is the more important of the two. The UBH program has in the past only yielded perhaps 5 to at the most 15 deer, and we count on the White Buffalo program to control the population density of the deer. The anecdotal evidence we have is that deer population density has increased, and we look to White Buffalo to bring it closer to our goal of about 20 per square mile.
Okay, thank you.
Just in case Grace Sinden is listening, the times and locations are in this agreement of the bow hunting that she was asking about.
In the contract, yes.
In the agreement.
Yes, it's Exhibit A to the UBH agreement.
Okay. All in favor for this resolution?
Aye.
Any opposed? The resolution passes unanimously. Next is Resolution 14-296, PSA with the Rogers Group for developing a strategic plan for the Princeton Police Department not to exceed $19,500. And Chief Sutter, do you want to comment on this?
Thank you, Mayor. I know we've talked about a strategic plan for a while now, and I don't want to, rehash what we've already spoken about, but I did brainstorm some key points that I feel the strategic plan brings to our department, and why we would need a consulting firm to accomplish it. Excuse me. So we're in a very special position right now as far as police departments go. We're very young. We've been through major change, and we have a huge future in front of us, and we don't have a lot of what we would call institutional knowledge from the standpoint of our consolidated department. And I think it's very important for stability internally and confidence externally in the department going forward that we have a plan that takes into consideration, most importantly, our external stakeholders, the community and the governing body, and the internal stakeholders, our police officers. It would be very easy for me to sit here and give you goals and objectives that I envision, and that's my vision. And maybe that's part of it, but that's only a small part of it. There's a whole bigger picture out there that I think this strategic plan is the vehicle to accomplish. Finally, I just want to say that I really feel very, very strongly that my job right now is the future of the department. We're kind of building a foundation. We have a very limited past, but a large future. And I feel very, very strongly if we do it correctly now, when I'm long gone and 10, 15 years down the road, we have built something and left a legacy that can be built on going forward. So I really find myself thinking about that a lot, and I think this accomplishes that. Finally, I was a little naive to the strategic planning process. I thought it was something that I could kind of sit down and put some goals and objectives down and talk to you, and I figured out it's a whole bigger process that completely exceeds my expertise or any expertise that we have internally and the resources that we have. So, in conclusion, we had two proposals that were given to us. I think they were, both good. I think the one that you have before you to decide on is really comprehensive, and there's some knowledge of the police department that's already there that'll help in this process. So that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Thank you.
I'll just add that it was discussed with the Public Safety Committee at several meetings, including the most recent one, and you did solicit bids. This is the lower cost bid, and also one that we thought actually would be better quality given the the firm's knowledge and, and dealings with the department, but it was also the lower bid.
Yes.
So we're excited to get that started. Ms. Butler?
We also discussed at the Public Safety Committee that we feel pretty strongly, even at the outset of this, that we're not looking for a recommendation that's just add more to the police department. So
absolutely not.
I want to make that clear up front. We don't need to spend $20,000 to get back that we need to add more. And I hope that we will have a data-driven report, crime statistics, what it might look like to lower crime statistics, service to the community, but also incorporate the university. And and their police force, the population versus, they have an actually larger public safety committee than we do police force. So I think it's important when we're looking at the public safety of our community that those numbers be figured in as well.
I totally agree with you, Ms. Butler, and I think that's my vision is just what you just explained, is that I envision you bringing that forward to the consulting group, things that I may not think of. I may have thought of some of those things, maybe not, and that's kind of the picture I think that I have for this plan. And as far as the number of officers, that's not even something that I was even thinking about. I'm more thinking about resource allocation of what we have now. How can we allocate the officers that we have now to better accomplish our goals more than the number?
Are you looking at just personnel or also equipment?
And again, in my, I guess, limited vision, it was personnel, but equipment's another issue that we can address in this. That's definitely something going forward that needs to be addressed, and we can include that. I mean, I believe that's also in the proposal, but I think it's flexible. In my conversations with them, they're willing to address any issues that come up from the stakeholders. That's what I like about it.
Okay.
I'll move it.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Howard and seconded by Mr. Liverman. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, excellent. We look forward to hearing more about this as the process moves forward. Next is 14-297, PSA Environmental Management Associates Remediation of Valley Road, Department of Public Works property, not to exceed $24,800. Are there any questions about this one? Is there a motion?
I'll move it.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Liverman. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Just a question about that. Bob, is that a consulting contract, or is that actually the contract to begin to move earth away from the site? Actually remediate the site?
This is a consulting contract. We're anticipating a cost in the neighborhood of approximately $75,000 to actually do the remediation that will be necessary.
Thank you.
It's going to cost $45 to consult and $75 to...
$25 to consult, and that provides for testing, laboratory fees, and so forth.
Let's take the next two resolutions together. 14-298, approval to submit a grant application to execute a grant contract with the New Jersey Department of Transportation for the Great Road Mountain Ave intersection signalization and walkway extension project. And Resolution 14-299, approval to submit a grant application and execute a grant contract with the New Jersey Department of Transportation for the Walnut Lane project. Is there a motion for these two?
So moved. Second.
It's moved by Mr. Liverman and seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Those two resolutions passed unanimously. Next is Resolution 14-300, amending previous shared services agreement with the Township of Montgomery for improvements along a portion of Cherry Valley Road.
So moved.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Ms. Krummeller. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The resolution passes unanimously. Next is Resolution 14-301, resolution of the Municipality of Princeton, County of Mercer, and State of New Jersey to oppose the Penn East Pipeline project. And is there anybody who wants to speak on this from the public? No? Okay. Is there a
I was
motion?
wondering where it came from, since the PEC, I don't think it came from the PEC.
It came because the county is taking action on this, and it's moving quickly. So I was contacted directly by a group that's been working on it in the county, including Friends of Princeton Open Space. I think the worry with the Pennies project is the pipeline is going through the Sourlands, and it's going through a lot of parks. It's going through some parks that are owned by Mercer County. And the precedent it sets by, I think when the pipeline companies come in and they look for a space to build, and they see all this open space, and do we really want pipelines now running through all of our open space? It's a frightening precedent because, given that there's the pipeline that's likely to go in here in Princeton, and then this one's next, and there's likely to be more being proposed as there's more and more fracking in Pennsylvania. So I think it calls for a more comprehensive attack at some point, but for right now, this was moving pretty quickly, so there was a desire for a lot of the neighboring communities and those in the county to make a stand.
Well, I'm fully supportive of it, and I'll move it.
I'll second it.
It's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Resolution passes unanimously.
I'm recusing.
Okay. Next is Resolution 14-302, refund of duplicate tax payment for 18 Hibben Road.
I'll move it.
Second.
It's moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Liverman. Any discussion on this? No. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. And the next is Resolution 14-303, bond sale, resolution determining the form and other details of $9,950,000 of general improvement bonds, Series 2014 of Princeton, in the County of Mercer, New Jersey, and providing for their sale. Are these the same? I think it just got written twice here on my copy.
They're two different ones.
Are there two different ones?
They're two different ones, but they're relating to the bond sale.
Okay, so do we take them together?
Yeah.
Then, okay, and then resolution providing for the combination of certain issues of general improvement bonds, Series 2014 of Princeton, in the County of Mercer, New Jersey, into a single issue of bonds aggregating $9,950,000 in principal amount.
So moved.
It's moved by Mr. Liverman, seconded by Ms. Krummeller. Are there any questions about this? No? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The resolution's passed
Do you have a
unanimously.
date for the bond sale?
Sandy, do you have a date? Do you know?
Bond sale date is, we're accepting bids on October 21st and closing on October 30th.
And I'll just repeat that so it gets recorded. It's going to open on October 21st and close on October 28th. Close on October 30th. Next is our consent agenda, which contains items of a routine nature that are passed by a single vote. Before I read through it, are there any items anyone wants pulled from the consent agenda? No? Okay.
Liz,
Yeah.
before you start, do you have to read them all?
Do I have to read them all, or can we just approve them?
Is it 1 through 7?
I don't think you have to read them all.
Okay. Well, if someone complains, then let us know for next time. We can do it again. Is that all right? All right. Okay, so consent agenda items 1 through 7.
Yeah.
I'll move.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Krummeller and seconded by Mr. Liverman. Excellent change. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The consent agenda passes. And now is there a motion to move into closed session?
So moved.
Moved by Ms. Butler and seconded by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Be it resolved by the mayor and council of Princeton, this body